Congressman LaTourette, thanks for joining us this week.
Sure.
So it's been a pretty hectic week here in D.C., and believe it or not, it's not just been all about politics.
Right.
There's actually been some legislative work getting done. So before we talk about the Iowa caucuses and the upcoming New Hampshire primary, wanted to start off with a little conversation about some of the things that have been happening legislatively.
Right.
For the last year or so, we've been kind of anxiously awaiting FAA reauthorization. We thought last summer we were going to see a bill dropped by Chairman Schuster in the House. That didn't happen, but this week it did happen. Talk to us a little bit about that bill and what the prospects for it are going forward.
It's a 6-year reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration, which is significant because we've had a number of extensions. The latest extension expires at the end of March. And I don't know of anyone that thinks the House is going to mark it up next week and then you'll have some floor time. That only gives the Senate 30 days to come up with their own bill and then have it go through conference and get to the President's desk. I don't think anybody expects that to happen by the end of March. So you're looking at another extension of at least a short period of time, I think. The FAA bill that was introduced by Chairman Schuster in the Transportation Committee in the House is interesting from a number of standpoints, and its major characteristic is that it proposes to privatize the air traffic control system. And that obviously has people on both sides pretty upset. The chairman's point is he can point to studies that show that privatizing and moving our air traffic control system faster to next generation, which is satellite-guided guidance systems rather than radar-based, can increase capacity by 30%, thereby speeding things up, ending congestion in the skies, and so forth and so on. Opponents, their primary argument is, look, this is a government function, and air traffic safety is a government function, and we shouldn't be handing it off to for-profit institutions who, could cut corners or whatever the case may be. So the early betting is that this is too ambitious, that in fact, I was with a member from the Transportation Committee last night who thinks it may not even pass the committee, but it probably passes the committee. But it's not going to go much further. The Democrats are very, very much lined up in opposition to this bill, and the early indications are that bipartisan senators are also opposed to this piece of legislation. So at this moment in time, this iteration of the FAA reauthorization bill doesn't look very good. For those who watch, who are frequent flyers, one thing you may or may not like is the bill proposes to ban cell phone calls during flights. So maybe they can pick that out if you think it's annoying that people should be able to talk on their cell phone. Well, this bill would prevent that.
I think that's a bipartisan thing. I think we can all get together on that issue. So I feel like we've had like 1 million votes on Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, in the House and Senate, particularly in the House, over the last couple of years. But this week we had another vote. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, at the beginning of this year, after Paul Ryan replaced John Boehner as Speaker, it was decided they got to get this, finally get a bill to the President's desk that would propose to repeal the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And so they did. They passed a bill in the House and Senate. It was conferenced and it was sent to the President's desk. It really should surprise no one that the President vetoed the bill. The interesting juxtaposition this week that I think makes Washington stranger than fiction sometime, on the very day the House was scheduled to vote to override the President's veto, the President invited Paul Ryan down to the White House for lunch. And it was to be their first one-on-one meeting since Ryan became the Speaker of the House. And so I found that to be a little bit interesting. Speaker Ryan was, I heard him on the radio, and he said, look, he knows where I stand, I know where he stands, I don't think it's going to be a big deal. And for crying out loud, I ran against him in the last election. Right. So I doubt that intruded on their lunch. But not surprisingly, the effort to override the President's veto, which needs 290 votes, failed. And at least for the moment, I think, until the presidential stuff is sort of all sorted out, I think we're done with the Obamacare repeal efforts, because the math just doesn't work.
We're done with the repeal efforts. We're certainly not done hearing about it
No, absolutely
in the
not.
political spectrum.
Oh, no, absolutely not. Everybody's, and then that was part and parcel of the strategy of getting the president a bill, because you could finally say, if you're opposed to the Affordable Care Act, I voted not only to repeal Obamacare 40 or 50 or 60 times, I also voted to override the president's veto. And it was the president that is defying the will of the people, will be the argument that some Republicans make.
Well, finally, on the legislative front, there have been a lot of happy talk about the budget process, particularly in the first few days, the honeymoon of Speaker Ryan's speakership. Seems like some of the happy talk is starting to subside, and we're starting to see some of the same rifts develop, particularly within the GOP caucus. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, as you may remember, the deal going out the door for Speaker Boehner was a 2-year budget deal, which is remarkable, and it sort of led to a collective sigh of relief in Washington, because we wouldn't, they thought, have the battle royale over the budget. The numbers would be set for the appropriators. They could go in and do their work early. And everyone pretty much, although you didn't know exactly what your program would receive or not receive, you knew what the top line numbers were, and pretty predictably it would probably follow year over year. The wrinkle that came up this week when Congress came back to town after the snowstorm was that the Freedom Caucus, which had been the thorn in the side of Speaker Boehner, has reared its head again and basically said that they're not going to abide by that 2-year budget deal, that was a bad deal struck by John Boehner, and they want Paul Ryan to abandon it, and they're not going to vote for any budget that unless at least $30 billion is cut from the budget. Now, that's a non-starter, but what it does do is set up the same sort of dynamics that Boehner faced, and it's going to be an interesting thing to see how Speaker Ryan deals with it. If he deals with it the same way Boehner did, I think he suffers the same fate as John Boehner. And so whether or not he has the ability to thread the needle on this, I think will be an interesting subplot to watch over the next couple of weeks to see, because again, just the math is that if these 30 or so Freedom Caucus members walk away from the Republican majority, you're under 218, which is the number of votes necessary to pass a budget and or appropriations bills. And if you deny the 218, you then have to go get Democrats. And when you go get Democrats, they obviously want some things in the bill as well.
Well, and this is exactly so funny, because this is exactly what Democrats were banking on. This is what, when they had their retreat in Baltimore, they specifically talked about, hey, we think that Ryan, it's all happy fun now, but we think the same fissures are going to rear their ugly heads. And even though we're in this super minority, it's our smallest caucus in a generation or two, we're still going to get something, because we think at the end of the day, Paul Ryan's going to have to come to us for votes, just like John Boehner did.
Yeah, and it's really too bad, because I mean, it's great from a partisan perspective. I mean, if you're a Republican and a conservative district, and you can come home and say, I'm cutting $30 billion from the budget, so forth and so on. But again, the way the government works is that you get some, and the other party gets some of what they're looking for, and so forth and so on. And otherwise, or you just bully it through. And if you don't have the votes to bully it through, the way that the Democrats did for 40 years when they had 290 votes and they could override vetoes, and the way that the Republicans have done since sometimes when they took over in 1994, then you have to find common ground if you can't get all your members on the same team. And there continues to be this lack of, they call them the vote no, hope yes crowd, because they believe, in their hearts that they would like to see a budget, they'd like to see, the country not shut down, but at the same token, they want that ability to go home and speak in front of very partisan crowds and about how tough they are.
Say, I'm pure.
I'm pure.
Well, speaking of political posturing, we've been talking about the presidential election, it seems like since the last presidential election ended. And finally, this week, we had votes cast. The Iowa caucuses were on Tuesday night. Ted Cruz won. Donald Trump, I can't believe I'm saying this. Donald Trump finished second. Marco Rubio, a surprising third.
Strong third.
On the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton apparently won. I say apparently because, I mean, if she did indeed win, it's the slimmest of margins possible. In the wake of the results, Rand Paul dropped out, Rick Santorum dropped out, Mike Huckabee dropped out, Martin O'Malley dropped out. I'm surprised Martin O'Malley was still running. But what does this all mean, especially as we now look Tuesday night, we're going to have the New Hampshire primary. What can we expect? What does this all mean?
Well, a couple of things. I think on the Republican side, after New Hampshire, unless a Jeb Bush or a John Kasich really pulls a rabbit out of a hat, you've settled into a three-man race on the Republican side with Senator Cruz, Donald Trump, and Senator Rubio. And a lot of folks are now, sort of thinking that Marco Rubio gets the mantle of establishment Republican. And that you have the outsider in Trump, and then you also have the arch conservative in Ted Cruz. And so the feeling that people who have been not happy about the direction the party is going in with some of this conservative business will now gravitate to Marco Rubio, and he then sort of moves to the front of the pack. The polling this week seems to demonstrate that in fact is happening. I think again, unless Jeb Bush and John Kasich can find lightning in a bottle, I think it's pretty much over for both of them. On the Democratic side, I got to tell you that was the slimmest of slim margins by Mrs. Clinton. Iowa has not been kind to her. It wasn't kind in 2008. New Hampshire has been kind to the Clinton family. I mean, remember President Clinton came in second to Paul Tsongas back
as the comeback kid.
As the comeback kid, and it really started his trajectory. And clearly, Mrs. Clinton is hoping for a sort of a repeat of that history. But I'll tell you that, I mean, the interesting thing to me as a Republican, as I watched the Democratic contest, is that Bernie Sanders seems to be able to replicate a lot of what Barack Obama had going for him in 2008. And there was just an article today that of Bernie Sanders' contributors, and they're about even in money, but 70% of the people that have given money to his campaign have done it in increments of $200 or less, as opposed to only 15% of the Clinton donations have come from those small donors. So he has figured out what President Obama figured out in terms of capturing the internet activist, small contributor donor, and I think you have a big enthusiasm gap. You also have a trust problem. The exit polls in Iowa indicated that 85% of the Democratic caucus goers said that they trusted Bernie Sanders. Only 10% said they really trusted Hillary Clinton. Well, and that's I think that's a problem. Now, having said all that, you can throw conventional wisdom out the window, because in the next set of primaries we go down below the Mason-Dixon line, and clearly the Clinton ties with the African American community together with some of the more northeastern liberal views of Bernie Sanders probably don't play so well in South Carolina.
Well, what's so fascinating to me is that I think everybody assumed that this 2008 Obama coalition, like that fired up young people, that brought in new voters, was really all about, he was a generational candidate. He was a young man, a first-term senator, fresh on the scene, and yet Bernie Sanders, 74 years old, who's been in Washington forever, who's a socialist, a self-avowed socialist, has pulled it back together, that same coalition. He won young voters by an 84-11 margin in Iowa. That is stunning, absolutely stunning. And I think you're right. Obviously, once we get beyond New Hampshire, the tables turn for Hillary Clinton. But do you think that this is a campaign that is going to go on for months rather than weeks?
I think it's going to go on for months, if only for the reason that Bernie Sanders is matching her almost dollar for dollar in contributions. And so whereas what usually happens after these early primaries, and you see it happening on the Republican side, that if somebody finishes in 5th place, their money begins to dry up, and they're an also-ran. One, the fact that you now have just a two-person competition on the Democratic side, and two, that Sanders has captured this fundraising magic. He has the ability to go deep, and it'll just be a question of, I think, I think he will have the ability to take this all the way to the convention. The question is what sort of margins does he face in some of the other states that obviously a Democrat needs to be successful in. New York and California, for instance. I mean, those are big states. But I think certainly Secretary Clinton gets a leg up in the short run with what they're calling the SEC primary in the southeastern United States will be the next round of primaries.
So, two exit questions. The polls right now show Donald Trump leading in New Hampshire. Yeah. It has been a large margin. That margin appears to be closing. Right. Bernie Sanders has led huge in New Hampshire. Remains to be seen whether or not that margin is going to tighten up some. Exit question here. Does Donald Trump hold on? Does Bernie Sanders hold on to win in New Hampshire?
I don't see Trump hanging on. I really, I don't. I see, maybe they're all in that mid-level. Maybe he wins with in a squeaker with 24%, but you also have Cruz with 24%, Rubio with 20%. And then a Jeb Bush or a Kasich, again, could surprise somebody. But I think at the end of the day, he hangs on. The bad news for Trump is that the people that sort of made up their mind in the last 24 hours in Iowa went overwhelmingly against Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And so if you have that sort of same dynamic, the voter that sort of isn't sure, I kind of like Trump because he says stuff that's on my mind. But then they say, is he really the President of the United States? Those people did not break his way. Bernie Sanders, I think he's going to win New Hampshire, in my opinion. The question is, does he hold that big margin? Or does Mrs. Clinton pull a Bernie Sanders in New Hampshire and narrow it to the point where,
she gets to declare herself the comeback kid.
Yeah,
what are the odds on hearing that?
No, that's right. And so that, to me, that's going to be the storyline out of New Hampshire. The interesting thing in both of these primaries, and it drives me a little bit nuts being, from a state like Ohio, that if you look at the number of people that went to the caucuses in Iowa, it's less people than votes I used to get running for Congress in a congressional district in Ohio. And the same thing in New Hampshire. New Hampshire has 2 members of Congress, and so that means roughly they have 1.5 million people, maybe a little bit more. And because of their early primary status, they're determining who the President of the United States is in many, many instances. And if you look at it, a lot of people get down and really understand how the caucuses work, because it's not an election where you go in and cast a ballot. I mean, the Democrats get into a room and they sort of, they go into their corners, and it's like, Red Rover. So Hillary Clinton's bunches over here, Bernie Sanders' bunches over here, and and somebody starts arguing on behalf of Bernie. Come on over, and you try and woo.
It seems like the perfect system for 1848.
Well, you try and woo people to come over to your corner, and that that then has led to this huge buzz. I mean, there were people saying there were more reporters in Iowa than there were caucus goers. And then I don't know. It's kind of a strange system we live in, but it is the system we live in, but it's turning into the fascinating election we thought it would be.
Well, and the good news is I bet we're going to be able to talk about this months and months to come.
I think you're right.
Congressman LaTourette, thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.